here's our miraculous survivor. I was almost sure you're going to just march by us and begin this battle all by yourself. Apologies, General, but after a few months of marching, I had to get the dust of the road out of my uniform. But here I am, so we may begin our assault. I also have a dispatch from the assembly for you. Here. You're not going to read it? It starts with as soon as you defeat Russian army, so I'd say it can wait. We may all end up dead before the day is done, so there's no need to bother with it now. I'll read it after the battle. Suit yourself. They gave me orders for later as well, and pardon my optimism, I actually read them. Can't say I'm thrilled about them, but it's not like I'm in any position to argue with Minister of War. And what do they want from you? I'm supposed to remain in Kiev until further notice and assist Daniłowicz's bean counters during confiscation of boyar estates and help with redistributing land. I'm alright with that part, but it's the second bit that bothers me. It stands here that we're also going to take lands from the Orthodox Church, and I'm pretty sure they're going to rile up the locals if we do that, so there may be some more bloodshed, even after the war is done. Still, the Assembly seems confident we shouldn't have too much trouble. They're sending some special advisor who's supposedly going to make everything go smoothly. Probably another brute from Public Decency, if I have to guess. You think they're going to send you after Poniatowski afterwards? Well, I hope not. The man is still a figurehead of our army, and the man could rebel if we tried to fight him. And I'm pretty sure he's been preparing for something like that for this past year, so he will be ready for us. Hell, if even a fraction of what people tell about him is real, then he certainly is not a man we could take down easily. Besides, we're just a few days away from peace, and the last thing we need is a civil war. On that we can agree. But changing subjects, I was looking at the plan of this attack you've sent me. Are you sure you're not going to need my men there on the field? I'm sure. Trust me, General, they'll be much more useful cutting off all retreat routes. If we want to end this war today, we must make sure not a single Russian will escape. Alright, I'll take my men and swing around Kiev then. Good luck. Let's hope we won't need it. I'll see you tomorrow. Greetings, my fellow Earthlings, and welcome back to the Crownless Eagle. In the last episode, our armies finally arrived at Kiev, the last refuge of Russian Tsardom, and began preparations for the final assault. And now, as you can see, we are already moving towards Russian forces, who decided to hold us at a small town some distance west of Kiev. Now, despite we've brought two armies to this fight, General Lichorobiec will not be joining us. The official reason, stated in Stolarski's orders, is that Lichorobiec is to take his force and circle around Russian army to cut off all their retreat routes to ensure we won't have to fight the remnants of this army in the future. But the second, more pragmatic reason is the fact that Stolarski simply commands a better army. His force is composed of veterans of our northern campaign, men who served under Lempicki and Prozmovski back in the day, while our other force, while it has some combat experience, is still mostly green. And since we're fighting an enemy who outnumbers us, and most importantly whose backs are against the wall, it would be best to bring our most experienced troops so this battle will proceed smoothly. Now, there will be one problem on this particular battlefield. As you've seen, Russians have placed their cannons in the middle of the town, obscuring their line of sight and rendering them useless. But, as it happens, the terrain on this battlefield is laid out in such a way that our own guns will have a hard time of hitting anything. It's difficult to see here, but we are actually deployed on a sunken ground, so we won't have a line of sight to most enemy units. So we must abandon our usual tactics of baiting enemy forward and simply march on ourselves. But that will mean our own units will obscure the view of our gun crews. They will still fire, but this time our barrage won't really give us any advantage, so now it's up to our regular infantrymen to deal with the enemy. Now, while most of Russian army is still marching through the town, several units on their right flank began this battle deployed much closer to our starting positions, and soon our advancing men found themselves under fire from Russian line infantry, so the battle has now officially begun. Now, engaging Russian infantry in a ranged combat at max distance is a bit of an unsure engagement. Russians are not as good at shooting as our troops, but there are quite a lot of them, which means they can fire more muskets to offset their lowered accuracy. Fortunately for us, our soldiers are in the better position this time. We have slightly higher ground, and we also have some more dense vegetation obscuring our men, giving them some visual cover. And also we have our national cavalry already working their way towards the rear of first enemy unit. As you can see, some Russians turn around to deal with that new threat, but most of their company remained focused on our infantry, and now they're going to pay the price of their lack of awareness. They immediately become shaken, but because they run forward towards our line, they actually manage to disrupt the impact of our cavalry, who will now have to engage them in regular melee. But, as you can see, these men are already wavering, and with fire coming from our men, it 'It won't be long before they break. 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 'It won't be long before they Now, there was an interesting situation in this fight, as one of our cavalrymen got completely surrounded by a dozen or so Russian soldiers. As you can see, he's swinging his lance left and right, desperately trying to keep enemies at a distance, when finally a volley from our ranks forces Russian infantrymen to retreat. Considering how inaccurate our muskets are, this cavalryman owes this company a round of drinks, because it's a bloody miracle they haven't shot him instead of all those Russians around him. On our right flank we've managed to secure better positions as well, and now our troops are engaged in a line battle from the cover of the small forest. With Russian units all bunched up in the open, I hoped we might simply be able to leave this flank to itself and focus on the other one, but as you can see, our enemies are not going to make this easy for us. Realizing that they cannot outshoot our soldiers in a firefight, several Russian units advanced forward under covering fire from their comrades, and the units that are creeping closer to us are actually the best units Russians have on this field. They're various elite variants of line infantry, especially suited for melee combat. So our men will have to cycle their volleys as fast as possible to reduce the numbers before they reach us. And back on our left flank, our cavalry just barely managed to stop one Russian foot regiment from unleashing a deadly point-blank range volley that could no doubt demolish our unit. And now a second national company is moving to the side of that melee, ready for a rear charge. So that Russian unit is as good as done. But now we must focus all our attention on our right. As you can see, we have failed to stop Russian advance, and now their men are bearing down on our lines, ready for a brawl. But as some of their units are already charging, other ones are opening fire at very close range, which will no doubt cause some serious damage among our soldiers. And now, as melees begin across the entire flank, all tactics and strategies are thrown out of the window. Superior skills and combat drills may be useful when fighting in a line battle, but in a mass close-range brawl with bayonets, it will be personal bravery, ferocity and willpower that will decide who wins and who dies. We can only hope our men will be the ones still standing after it's over. There has been some cock-up on our left as well. As you can see, some of our cavalrymen were so eager to chase enemy runners that they got under fire from Russian infantry. Our men managed to get a hold of themselves and turned around to retreat, but not before losing a good number of their comrades to incoming fire. They will now retreat, reform and try to avenge their friends by taking that unit out, but we can't afford such mistakes in the future, especially not with our national cavalry, who are our most expensive and prestigious unit. But it looks like after several years of winning battles against Sweden, even our regular basic line infantry now have several tricks up their sleeves. As you can see, our men are able to hold Russian attack relatively well. There are heavy losses on both sides, but slowly we're gaining the upper hand, and that's because of steady fire coming from our back ranks. While some of our units are keeping Russians busy in melee, other ones are still cycling volleys at a point-blank range. If we can keep this up, we should be able to win. More importantly, we still have two fresh units of national cavalry on this side of the field, and now that entire Russian left flank is engaged in melee, we have a perfect opportunity to use them. We even managed to set them up for a perfect charge, but as you can see, quite a lot of them are actually hesitant to commit to the attack, and it takes our officers several tries to finally convince their men to man up and charge, and even that half-ass attack is enough to convince Russian soldiers to give up the fight and leave. But now, as they turn to flee, they will have to run right through our cav units, who will hack them to pieces. And those who will manage to get through our soldiers with all their limbs intact will be greeted by our Kalmuks, who are running rampant across enemy rear, shooting arrows at anyone who tries to escape. In one swift move, we've eliminated about 1,000 men. Bloody, but effective. Now the thing is that because there is a town in the middle of the field, the other half of Russian army decided that they don't want to bother going through it and instead sent all their remaining men around. And now all of a sudden our left flank has been swarmed by several Russian units charging into melee, with another few staying in the back providing fire support. Now, Russian attack was rather odd. They just sort of marched right into the middle of our formation, with both sides really ignoring each other for a while, before they finally realized they're enemies and should actually do some fighting. And that is actually very bad for us, because some enemy soldiers managed to march right through our formation, and now they will be able to attack our men from behind, inflicting morale penalty. Our cavalry is already moving in to help out, but there are more Russians hanging back, so we'll have to deal with them first before we can help our infantry. And they will most certainly need help, because they're fighting professional Russian line troops. More importantly, we can't really spare any more units to go to our left to help, because even though we've managed to eliminate most enemy units on our right, there are still a few of them harassing us across the line. For now, it seems our left flank will have to hold on their own. However, with Russians gaining the upper hand in this melee, I've decided to go for a risky move and attack with my cavalry immediately, before dealing with enemy support units. And as you can see, the arrival of our men changed almost nothing. Russian soldiers have been crushed between our units, but they still fight on, shaken but still able to resist our attack. And now, slowly, it's becoming clear that our 16th Light Regiment probably won't be able to hold on for much longer. Our men are still confident, but they're taking way too many losses to keep this up, so we're going to have to relieve them in some way while we still can. But I reacted too late, and before I finally decided to support that fight with another unit, soldiers of 16th Regiment have lost their hope and begun to run away. Still, they've managed to hold on long enough for that other company to arrive, so now our broken men should be able to withdraw without anyone pursuing them, which is always the most damaging part of any battle. And most importantly, the arrival of our reinforcements was also enough to break the Russians, who are far less lucky being stuck between our troops. So now we're going to chase them down with our cavalry, where our foot soldiers will try to reform the line. At this point though, most of enemy army has been broken, leaving only a handful of units still trying to contain us. One of that units was enemy Tatar company, the clone version of our Kalmuks. Both units engaged in a rather dull-looking exchange of arrows, but our men managed to score the first volley, and so, since both of the units are exactly the same except for their names, that means we're going to win this fight. It's going to take quite a while, and we'll actually take some considerable losses during it, but it's quite possibly one of the last times when two bow units will fight each other on the battlefield surrounded on all sides by muskets and cannons. And it is good to know that in this historic duel we'll be the winning side. But the Russians are still not done for. In fact, they still have one last insult to throw at us. Their gun crews, who did nothing for the entire battle, dropped their artillery pieces and charged at one of our infantry units in the very center of the town, right in front of the town hall. At first I wanted to just drop them down with a volley, but then I decided that, to hell with this, let them have the last charge. Now, my men probably don't share my sentiment, because despite this situation being completely one-sided, Russian gunners still managed to take down some of our soldiers. A bad way to go right at the end of war. But, despite that last show of valor, you can predict how this ended. Still, two of enemy gunners managed to get away, and this time our soldiers decided to let loose and play a cruel game with the survivors. The entire unit stopped, calmly loaded their muskets and opened fire at two Russian artillerymen. The first volley did absolutely nothing. The second one was just as embarrassing as the first. Only third, final one managed to hit one of the runners, and after this embarrassing show of marksmanship, among jeers and laughter coming from neighboring units, the regiment commander ordered his men to cease fire, claiming that this single Russian soldier earned his life. But that doesn't really matter. As you have seen, the battle was already won. This last charge of artillerymen was the last throw of dying Russian Empire. We are victorious, and our long war is finally over. We can finally enjoy the peace. And here we are at the results screen, and as you can see, our National Cavalry was the star of this battle, scoring over 2,000 kills between their 4 units. Overall, all of our men did a good job today, but despite that, Russian last stand still costed us over 1,000 men. But now we finally don't have to rush with calling for reinforcements, because for the first time since war with Sweden began in 1704, we no longer have any enemies. More than that, we don't even need a full army to hold Kiev. When our men were approaching the city, I was expecting some serious unrest that could lead to rebellion, but as this screen shows us, Russians are actually very much okay with our arrival. They too must be tired of war, and so are eager to welcome peace, even if it means that it's a peace under different banners. That, and quite possibly that mysterious advisor had something to do with this peaceful transition. So, now that military business is over, we can start rebuilding. We're going to send a request for more men, just in case, and in the meantime we'll start rebuilding the city and the area around it. Our magistrates will redistribute noble lands, increasing farm efficiency, while other men will introduce our new industrial inventions into slightly backwards workshops around Ukraine. The job may be over for our armies, but for the country in general, the work never ends. And so, with winter arriving in Europe once again, everything around Republic slows down. The Horobis began marching back north towards our heartlands following his new secret orders, and in Ukraine, even if there were some rebellious groups planning some sort of uprising, the cold will surely keep them in check. The situation seems so calm that Stolarski have actually invited his nephew for a visit, and it shows us that our guard commander is actually a man of great heart, because his nephew is not the sharpest man who ever lived, and his in-game description is putting some very graphic images into my head, images I'd rather not see. Still, it seems that Stolarski's nephew quickly became sort of an army mascot, his unwavering eagerness clearly overshadowing his poor mental faculties. And if that makes our men happy, then more power to the boy. But more importantly, it's a sign. If a general of our frontline army invites his dumb relative into a conquered city, it can only mean one thing. The situation is returning to normal, and our people begin to relax after a long war. I'd say they deserve rest. But the assembly is still not sated. When the war with Russia began, we wanted to take control of 3 northernmost provinces, and while we managed to gain Archangels and Komi, at least Poniatowski did, Crimean Hanad beat us to Bakshiria, the easternmost region of the map that borders Ural Mountains. So, with all the money we're earning, now that our country is once again focused on civilian production, we've approached the Han himself and offered him an outrageous sum of 45,000 gold pieces for the land. And as you can see, he agreed, and this boost of money will certainly help him in his war against Austria. So now, we not only achieved our goal, we also gained something extremely important, access to Ural Mountains and all the lands behind them. The entire vastness of Siberia waits there ready to be colonized and exploited by our republic. It's going to be a while before we can afford it, but it opens up so many possibilities it will certainly be worth it. And most importantly, it made Assembly realize the power of our now stable economy. And that gave them another idea. My thanks for such splendid accommodations, Prime Minister, but I'm afraid this conversation leads us nowhere. It is quite simply impossible for United Provinces to commit to an alliance, because we are already embroiled in one with Austria and Great Britain. An alliance, you say? Pardon my bluntness, but to an outside man it looks more like a servitude. You are a republic led by a king. More than that, it's a king of a foreign power whose interests are clearly opposed to your own. You would do well to remember that King Willem is of Dutch blood and heritage. He is no more foreign to us as you are to your own citizens. And yet, he chose not Amsterdam but London as his seat of power, and for the past few years he used the might of Dutch trade fleets to bolster Britain, not Netherlands. Wasn't it King William who dragged you into this costly war with Mughal Empire? War that only he profits from? Wasn't he the one who rushed into French colonial possessions after you did all the hard work dealing with Sun King's armies in Europe? Ever since this alliance, no personal union began, he is merely funneling your wealth and your power into London. Is this what United Provinces are? A tool to be used by an overly ambitious monarch? Besides, King William is not getting any younger. Do you really think his successor, raised in English court, will refrain from draining your nation even more? I know it must be difficult for you to speak about this, Ambassador, but the truth is that if you won't act now, while British are busy in India, you may never again have a chance to break free, and we are offering to help you with that. That's awfully kind of you to offer help, Prime Minister, but you'll excuse me if I doubt your generosity. Then let me assure you, Ambassador, that this is not generosity that makes me offer our help. Merely profit for all involved. You are aware, no doubt, that our republic is currently becoming an industrial powerhouse. With all the goods we produce, we need markets to sell them. And who but United Provinces, the greatest mercantile power on earth, can be a better trading partner? With your connections around the globe and with our manufacturing power, we stand to become the most influential, and more importantly most wealthy, nations in the world. But the British use their naval superiority to dictate rules of our trade. I'm painfully aware of that, Prime Minister, but while there are many councillors who would agree with you, we cannot help, not with Willem still having so many supporters among the stadtholders. And this is precisely what we want to help you with. We're aware that war against Britain is not in anyone's interest, but if you gathered enough support among your own stadtholders to simply vote William out, would he actually dare to oppose your decision militarily? I suppose he wouldn't, not with war in India and unrest in the New World and Spain keeping him busy. But this is a monumental undertaking you're talking about. One mistake and we risk British fleets completely locking us out of international trade. And while your country can survive this thanks to your industry, ours would collapse in a matter of months. which is why we're willing to invest heavily in your cause. Now that our wars are over, we can afford it. Nobody in Europe profits from British trade monopoly, so we can offer you assistance in many forms. We could send you military supplies and advisors to help you finally pacify the French countryside. We could draft some preferential trade deals that would give your merchants an edge when purchasing goods from us. And we can, of course, simply send you money. Enough of it to grease palms that require greasing. It does sound good. It will be difficult but doable. I'm going to have to talk with my associate in Stadtholder Council about your offer before we decide, of course. And I advise you against sending money. British Empire has enough influence and people in our banks that they will no doubt notice any extraordinary sum appearing in our treasury without reason. They may start asking questions. Which is why I have another offer for you, and not just an offer, a bargain. Now, if you would join me in the map room, I'm going to explain everything. That's right, ladies and gentlemen, thanks to irresistible power of gold, we've gained control of Curaçao, island in the middle of the Caribbean. Now, Curaçao wasn't my first choice. First I wanted to buy Cuba or Hispaniola from the Spanish, but then I remembered that Spain is actually fighting England, the most dangerous nation in the world right now, so I've decided they probably need all their regions to keep their economy running. That, and of course if we have to gain some land, it would be best to get it from our soon-to-be rivals. So then I wanted to buy Jamaica from the British, but they weren't really eager to even listen to my offer, and so I approached the Dutch and purchased Curaçao. So now we have a foothold in the Americas, and most importantly, we have gained our very first colonial possession, and all the goods and prestige that comes with it. But that is, hopefully, just the beginning. See, at this time Caribbean islands are still infested with pirates, so much in fact that when French monarchy in Europe collapsed, said pirates seized power on Martinique, one of French colonial islands. Now aside from that, pirates control two more regions, Antigua and Trinidad. Now I wasn't really paying attention to Caribbean until recently, and I genuinely thought some major power have already dealt with pirates, but it turns out the wars in Europe and India keep everyone busy, so the pirates had time to dig in. And so, now that we can use Curaçao as a staging ground, we can take them out ourselves, and take their islands in the process, gaining us territory without having to fight any other nation. Time to prepare for a long journey. Few months later, we are informed that a way to produce Chinaware has been discovered. And let me just say that I absolutely love those little information windows that pop up now and then in this game, but some of you might be wondering why this particular information is so important it deserves its own pop-up. Well, there's several reasons. The first one being the fact that trade is, well, weird, and quite often things that don't really have any solid value become expensive simply because they are rare. Think of goods imported back to Europe during 18th century. Things like spices and sugar were used as preservatives, and cotton made European textile industry boom. So these goods were valuable because they were useful. But then think of things like tea, coffee, ivory and tobacco. While you can at least argue that tea is a healthy drink and coffee gives you energy boost, ivory and tobacco are useless. And yet they have become one of the more expensive commodities based solely on their rarity, as only rich and powerful had enough wealth to own them. It was the same with Chinaware, but in this case the prices were even higher because nobody knew how to make it. The Chinese kept the recipe closely guarded for hundreds of years. And so, when someone finally figured out this oriental secret, which is actually quite a complicated process that involves several ingredients like alabaster, clay and kaolite being ground, mixed and heated in very specific proportions, great many people who could only dream about displaying some fancy porcelain plate in their home suddenly had an opportunity to do so. Of course, original Chinese porcelain was still much more valuable, but now people had access to a substitute. And besides, in 1712, Europeans have actually managed to get their hands on original Chinese recipe, which increased the quality of home-produced goods even more. Second reason was the fact that in 18th century China had some internal problems going on. In 1683 it was conquered by Manchurians, who were pushing for increased isolationism, which elevated prices of Chinese goods. And finally, in early 18th century, China was still something relatively new to Europeans. Across the entire continent, people were fascinated by this Far Eastern Empire so much that anything that came from there was immediately idolized, and as such became more expensive. For example, Tsarina Catherine the Great, the woman responsible for partitioning of Poland, commissioned an entire Chinese village to be built at her estate, and the last Polish king, and I will not mention his name, constructed a Chinese-style temple in his palace gardens. But, of course, such things were mostly only available to the most rich and powerful, and so Chinese porcelain was the only thing that was relatively easy to obtain by the general population. And now that we know how to make it ourselves, these hundreds of workshops we've opened across the country will have a new way to earn money. And as our people will get rich, we will become wealthy as well. And if there's money to be made in the East, the same can be said about the West. And so it's time for a Caribbean campaign, and the man leading it will be none other than commander of our Second Eastern Army, General Bartosz Lichorobiec. For several months, he and his men were gathering supplies and training, keeping their mission in secret, and now together with Bobrovsky they are ready to begin. So, our first colonial army boards the ships and prepare for the long, arduous journey to the Caribbean. But they're not going to go straight into the fight. Our commander realized that his men are not used to either long sea journeys or the weather that awaits them in the Caribbean, and so we first are going to make a stop in Curaçao. We're going to resupply there, give our C6 soldiers some time to rest, and most importantly, we will link up with 2 colonial units that have been trained on the island. These 2 units will serve as local guides and advisors, so hopefully with them on this mission, Caribbean jungles won't just chew us up. We're going to leave 2 units in the area to keep the strength of the local garrison, but these men will have another job as well. They will start building up our headquarters and training local troops. After all, we want to become a respectable presence in the area. And what better way to do it than by deploying hundreds of armed men? Next month, everything is ready to begin our operation. Lichorobiec and his men board the ships, this time they only have a few days on sea ahead of them instead of few months, and we set sail for the southernmost pirate-controlled island, Trinidad. We can land without much troubles, and immediately our men begin marching inland towards fortified town deeper on the island. And as you can see, pirate defenders are really disorganized. They have several groups of units roaming around the island, and so I decided we can easily auto-resolve this battle. After all, we have disciplined men under our command, and pirates can only throw poorly armed mobs against us. But, as you can see, even though we are victorious, we took some ridiculously high losses there. But while I'm sure pirates did their best, I'm also fairly certain it was nature itself that did most of the damage. The best bet would be malaria, brought by countless slave ships sailing from Africa. Not only that, the climate itself is probably very difficult for our men, as every single wound will fester much faster as infections are more common in hot, humid climates. And let's not forget that at this time in history, in year 1708, medicine is still mostly practiced by big, strong men holding hacksaw in one hand and bottle of strong, pain-numbing alcohol in the other. And even if someone survived the pain of amputated limb, the infection would still most probably finish them off. It will be 139 years until in year 1847 one Hungarian doctor named Ignaz Semmelweis will figure out the correlation between unwashed hands and medical instruments and infections. I know it may sound weird today, I mean most of the people today wash their hands dozens of times, some even have OCDs regarding it, but before second half of 19th century nobody even considered that. In Semmelweis's case, his fellow doctors performed autopsies and then, without even spitting on their hands, went upstairs to, quote, heal, unquote, pregnant women. Death rate was up to 30%, something almost impossible to believe today. So, Semmelweis ordered his people to wash their hands in chlorine, first only after autopsies and then between every procedure. The results were amazing. 30% death rate turned into 1 or 2%. Sounds awesome, am I right? Well, not exactly, because at this time nobody believed Semmelweis. This is absolutely worst part of his history, the part where sheer stupid stubbornness costs lives. Semmelweis produced results, his mortality rates dropped like crazy, but the so-called medical authorities decided his findings are just rambling of a madman. Hell, his own staff thought his orders to wash their hands were insane and annoying, and they were people who witnessed his result firsthand. And so, for his efforts that probably saved countless lives, he was rewarded by being expelled from his hospital in 1849, and in 1865 he was placed in an asylum for constantly defending his methods, and soon he was forgotten. And the best part? Semmelweis died on August 13th. One day earlier, on August 12th, Mr. Joseph Lister applied some phenol, or carbolic acid, to his lancet before performing an operation and realized that such sterilization reduces chances of infection almost to zero. Soon he began washing his hands, instruments and medical equipment in it, eliminating most infections from his medical practice once and for all. And after he published his findings 2 years later, he became one of the most renowned doctors in the world, becoming royal physician, and today we know him as one of the fathers of modern medicine. That makes Semmelweis' story even sadder. If he lived only one day more, he would have at least died knowing he was right. But of course, even though humanity learned about preventing infections, we still had no idea where they came from, at least until the year 1876, when another man, Robert Koch, sat down in front of a microscope and found bacteria responsible, in this particular case, for anthrax. Unfortunately for our men, these discoveries are still a century and a half ahead of them, so they will have to just bite their teeth and march on. Windward Islands won't conquer themselves. But this little hiccup in the Caribbean can't overshadow one thing. Our economy has finally recovered from the wars, and as a result of that we are now ridiculously rich. So rich, in fact, that I decided to buy another region, a very special one. As you may remember, a long time ago, when we were still a monarchy, King August gave Kaiser Leopold lands of Podolia as a tribute to keep Austrian armies from conquering us. Since then, this region turned into a war zone. For the last 7 years it was occupied by Austrians, Russians, Ottomans and Crimeans. A month ago it was in Austrian hands, but now some brave Crimean commander managed to bypass imperial armies and stole the capital of the region, Lvov, right from under their noses. And since we're on the very good terms with Crimean Khanate, we are financing most of their war effort against Austria, we have a perfect opportunity to peacefully retake our lands. Our first offer, roughly half of our treasury, is thrown away, and for the moment I almost gave up. But then I realized that even if we give Han all of our money, we will simply earn it back within a few months. And so I decide to just give them everything I have, well, almost everything, since it's always good to have some reserve, just in case. Not only we can get that money back relatively quickly, in this case we can be almost certain this gold will be used to fight Austrians, something that is really good for us. And this time the Khan agrees, and so, without spilling blood or firing a single shot, we have regained the land we've lost all these years ago. No doubt Austrians will be furious about that, but with Ottomans, Crimeans and Mughals keeping them busy, I doubt they will do anything about it. More than that, we bought Crimeans some breathing room by greatly reducing their front line. Now the fighting should move to Moldavia, and Austrians will be forced to march their troops across Carpathian mountains to get there, which will surely put a strain on their supply lines. And of course we moved all the fighting slightly further away from our capital. And it made the assembly think. Within a year, they thought, we earned enough money to buy 3 regions. Imagine what we could do if we had a decade. But for now though, we're still going to expand our lands the old-fashioned way, with fire and sword. With fresh batch of troops arriving from the Republic, Lee Horowitz's army regained its fighting capability and sailed on north towards Martinique, eager to show what they have learned from their fight on Trinidad. And this time we're going to be more meticulous. We won't just chase pirates around the entire island, giving them a chance to ambush us using their knowledge of local terrain. Instead, we will search Martinique meter by meter until these outlaws have no more place to hide. And then, we will face them in the open, where they will see true power of Republican armies. We will find out how this goes in the next episode of the Crownless Eagle. See you next time. With war against Russian Tsardom finally over, Polish-Lithuanian Republic entered a time of great prosperity. As workshops across the country switched their focus from military production to civilian one, the amount of goods they generated surprised even the most optimistic investors. Within mere months of surprisingly peaceful capture of Kiev, Republican treasury expanded dozenfold, for the world, still mostly reliant on artisan craftsmen, yearned for goods produced in Polish manufactories. With new ideas for improving production appearing almost every day, the Republic became the workshop of the world, and before year 1708 came to a close, people around Europe wore Polish clothes and worked using Lithuanian tools. Though not as prestigious as goods imported from the Far East, Republican goods dominated markets around the continent with their sheer cheap availability. But the expansion did not stop there. Using their newfound wealth, National Assembly began a series of negotiations, from the Ural Mountains in the east to Caribbean islands in the west, and without a single shot the Republic grew to encompass more and more land, and with Podolian Accords, signed in the summer of 1708, a new era for the Republic began, an era of peaceful expansion. But not everything was proceeding as smoothly as outside observers believed. While Polish industry grew, their agriculture faltered. More constant wars around southern borders of the Republic forced tens of thousands of people to seek refuge in Commonwealth lands, putting even more strain on already overstretched farms. The industry that boomed so efficiently in the months after the war threatened to collapse upon itself. As more and more goods were produced, the prices fell, which forced Republican government to look for different markets for their commodities, a move that annoyed British Empire, who controlled most of Europe's overseas trade. And of course there was a matter of Caribbean campaign. After collapse of French monarchy, its colonial possessions were left in disarray. On the North American mainland, provincial governors declared their independence, fragmenting already weak hold France had on the continent. And on the Caribbean, local outlaw bands seized an opportunity to use French colonial infrastructure to create Pirate Kingdom. The Brotherhood of Seven Seas, as they called themselves, gained so much power and influence that not a single colonial power was able to dislodge them from Windward Islands they claimed as their home. However, Polish acquisition of Curaçao placed a new player on the scene, and soon 2nd Eastern Army under General Lichorobiec was dispatched to deal with the pirates, both to increase Republican holdings and to secure the shipping lanes leading back to Europe. But while the plan to conquer Caribbean seemed relatively simple, the reality proved to be far more grim. Diseases like malaria and yellow fever decimated Commonwealth's army, already weakened after spending months at sea without proper training. The land itself was working against Republican soldiers, who were not used to heat, humidity and dense jungles of the Caribbean. By the time they've captured their first island, half of 2nd Eastern Army was gone, and the other half was in no shape to continue fighting. Assembly's colonial campaign not only proved more costly than anticipated, it was also the first crack on the undefeated, monolithic image of Republican armies.